Chapter 15 discusses direct assistance to teachers, and the direct assistance is in the form of clinical supervision, so I will be discussing the steps of the clinical supervision process. I will be discussing supervisory approaches appropriate for clinical supervision, the difference between reciprocal and expert peer coaching, some strategies a mentor can use to assist a beginning teacher, and how teachers can foster a democratic and moral society. What is the clinical supervision model? As many of us are familiar, as we completed in Project 2, the clinical supervision model was derived from the work of Morris Coggin with some supervisors of intern teachers at Harvard University. And this chapter discussed that this clinical supervision model is consistent and consists of principles and a structure. So there are 12 principles, and then there's a very specific structure, and it follows 5 steps in that structure. So first I'm going to be talking about the 12 principles that make up clinical supervision process. The first one and most important one is it's classroom-based. It has a purpose, both the improvement of instruction and the teacher's long-term professional development. It's important to remember that it's separate from summative evaluation. It requires that us as the supervisor, we have an understanding of child development, we have an understanding of pedagogy and teacher development. It requires that we as the supervisors possess interpersonal observation and problem-solving skills. One thing that is also very important to remember that it is not judgmental. This is used to improve the teacher's instruction, but it is not meant to be judgmental of the teacher. It has to be based on mutual trust. It requires a relationship with the teacher and the supervisor that they are considered equals. It's almost not a supervisor-teacher relationship, but one that is equal, and both of them contribute to the improvement process. It needs to be data-based. It gathers data on the teacher's concerns or curiosities about the lesson, and that's one of the during the structure of this process that would be discussed during the pre-conference. So you would gather the teacher's curiosities about the lesson that the supervisor is going to observe. It involves the teacher and the supervisor engaging in reflective dialogue. And it needs to be something, it's a cycle. It's repeated on a regular basis. It's not effective if it's just conducted one time. So those were the 12 principles. Now I'm going to talk about the structure. So there are 5 basic steps: the pre-conference with the teacher, the observation of the classroom, the analysis of the observation and data and planning for the post-conference, the post-conference with the teacher, and the critique of the previous 4 steps. So I'm not going to touch in a whole lot of detail because we did complete this in Project 2 and most of us are familiar with the structure. So the supervisor sits with the teacher during the pre-conference to determine the purpose of the observation. This is when you would talk about those teachers' curiosities. What will the focus of the observation be, and the method and form of the observation to be used. And it is important to remember that the teacher and the supervisor are both very clear about what's going to happen during the observation. Step 2 is the actual observation. So this is the time to follow through with the understanding that occurred during the pre-conference. And then this is when the observer uses one of the observation methods or combined to actually conduct the observation. And it's important to remember the difference between descriptions of events and interpretations. And it is really important as the supervisor conducting the observation that we keep the observation descriptive and don't leave room for interpretation. Step 3 is the analysis and planning. So the supervisor, after they've conducted the observation, leaves the room and seeks solitude. It's important to study the data that was collected and kind of make sense out of this large amount of information that was just observed. And it's important to do that fairly soon after you've done the observation. Don't let a lot of time pass. And then after that, the supervisor must choose which interpersonal approach to use with the teacher for the post-conference. And those approaches which were directive, informational, collaborative, and non-directive, those were explained in chapters 8, 9, and 10 of our text. And as the supervisor, we have to choose which approach we're going to take based on the teacher's level of development, expertise, and commitment. With the completed observation form, analysis, and the approach, then the supervisor is ready to meet for a post-conference. So during that post-conference, the supervisor shares the observation data and the analysis, and then the supervisor interprets the meaning of the data and then produces a plan for instructional improvement. So during this time also, the teacher can reflect on the data and the supervisor continues with the chosen approach. And the last and final step is the critique. So the critique of the 4 previous steps, a time to review the format, the procedures, all the way from the pre-conference to the post-conference. What went well, what was satisfactory, what revisions might need to be made, because this is a process that is repeated. And so you need to critique your process this time to see what revisions might need to be made when you conduct it again. So integrating clinical supervision and developmental supervision. So developmental supervision calls for the supervisor to match one of the 4 interpersonal approaches with the teacher developmental levels, expertise, and commitment. So they're going to choose directive control, directive informational, collaborative, or non-directive. And typically directive, which we practiced with Dr. Quick, that is used in rare situations. I believe she said like 3 to 4% of teachers. And so when you do the clinical supervision approach, typically to do a directive control approach is not typically going to be effective. It should only be used short term, kind of in a crisis situation, not part of the normal cycle. Typically you're going to most teachers will fall into that collaborative approach. Another thing I'm going to touch on in this chapter is peer coaching. Teachers naturally turn to one another for help more than they turn to a supervisor. So teachers helping teachers has become a formalized and well-received way of ensuring direct assistance. And the use of this has been, teachers helping each other through the clinical supervision has been labeled as peer coaching. So what's the difference between reciprocal coaching and expert coaching? Reciprocal coaching is when a teacher observing and conferring with each other. So when one teacher maybe is conferring with someone on their team, someone that teaches the same grade level as them. Expert coaching is when a better trained or more experienced teacher assists a lesser trained or lesser experienced teacher. It's important to decide the purpose and goals of the peer coaching program. So when your school is looking for a program to use, it's important to decide the purpose and the goals. So will it consist of reciprocal coaching or expert coaching? Who is the recipient of assistance? Will the observations and feedback focus on a common instructional skill that every teacher is attempting to learn and implement, or will the observations provide feedback that focus on a teacher's concerns with their teaching? So is it something that every teacher is working on, or is it something that one specific teacher, a skill that they might be working on? And is the goal to be greater awareness and more reflective decision making, or is it the implementation of a new particular skill? So meeting with the teacher to discuss how a proposed peer coaching program would fit into the school's instructional goals, and then you have to decide on the specific purpose. So the preparation that goes into it, understand the purpose and the procedures of peer coaching, conduct a pre-conference to determine the focus of the observation, conducting and analyzing an observation to distinguish the difference between observing and interpreting classroom events, and then conduct 2 post-conferences with different approaches to develop action plans. One non-directive and one with a collaborative approach. To have an effective peer coaching program, it takes about 6 hours minimum to provide the knowledge and skills. After the first implementation of peer coaching, follow-up meetings should be held to discuss what happened. And peer coaching, of course, should be based on agreement and volunteerism. People are more likely to buy in if they're volunteering themselves to do it. The scheduling of peer coaching is important. Again, if you're volunteering, it's important to place teachers together on teams that share the same planning time or the same lunch period. That would allow for the pre and post conferences to happen during the day, not outside of their teacher's school day, contract time, or even hiring subs would allow teachers to be relieved of class duties. So the types of mentoring, again, were reciprocal mentoring, which involves experienced teachers mentoring each other. And then reverse mentoring is when a new or younger member of a school serves as a mentor to an older, experienced mentor. Here's some benefits. I'll just read a few. Some benefits of effective mentoring for beginning teachers: better classroom management. You can be a great teacher, but if you don't have good classroom management skills, then your teaching isn't as effective. I believe that another benefit is increased self-confidence and an understanding of the school's culture and norms, are just a few. So using direct assistance to improve school culture. So most direct assistance is for the purpose of improving teachers' skills. Direct assistance can help teachers reach deep goals. So some of the questions that to improve classroom culture, you might be asking questions like, are students treated equitably by the teacher and each other? Did the teachers and students follow a democratic principle approach to student ages and maturity levels? So using the clinical supervision, the peer coaching, and the mentoring, all of these can be used to answer these important questions.